The helicopter blades were still spinning when the doors of the emergency bay burst open, and the sound that followed was not screaming, not shouting, but a deep, rolling growl that froze every person in the hallway. Master Chief Ethan Cole lay strapped to a stretcher, his uniform torn and soaked through, his face pale under the harsh white lights. Beside him, pressed so close that his body nearly covered his handler's chest, stood a Belgian Malinois named Titan, teeth bared, eyes locked on anyone who dared step closer. Two flight medics tried to push the stretcher forward. Titan lunged, snapping at the air just inches from their gloved hands. They stumbled back, and for a moment, the entire trauma bay stood frozen, caught between the urgency of a dying man and the fury of the one creature who refused to let him go. "Get that dog off him," barked Dr. Daniel Brooks, the lead trauma surgeon, his voice sharp with the kind of controlled panic only a man who had seen too many deaths could carry. "He's bleeding out. We don't have time for this." But Titan did not move. He planted his paws firmly on either side of Ethan's shoulders, his growl deepening, his gaze sweeping across the room like a soldier scanning for threats. To him, every white coat, every gloved hand, every fast movement looked like danger. And danger meant only one thing: protect. Nurse Grace Turner tried next, holding out a muzzle strap, speaking in the calm, practiced tone she used with frightened patients. Titan's growl turned into something closer to a snarl, and she backed away, heart hammering. "He's not going to let anyone near him," said Henry Dawson, one of the flight medics who had ridden in with them, his uniform stained dark from the mission that had nearly cost both the SEAL and his dog their lives. "They've been through 3 deployments together. That dog thinks the whole hospital is the enemy." Dr. Brooks looked at the monitor beside the stretcher. Ethan's blood pressure was dropping fast, the numbers falling like a countdown. Every second spent negotiating with an animal was a second closer to losing him completely. "Sedate the dog," Brooks ordered. "Now!" A veterinary technician appeared with a tranquilizer dart gun, hands trembling slightly as she loaded it. But before she could raise it, a young nurse who had been observing from the doorway stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Wait," said Marin Ellis. "Please, just wait 1 second." Brooks turned toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "We don't have a second, Ellis. This man needs surgery immediately. If you shoot that dog full of tranquilizers while he's this wound up, his heart rate could spike dangerously," Marin said, stepping further into the room, slow and unthreatening. "And if he collapses on top of the patient, you'll lose access to him anyway. Give me a moment, just 1 moment." The room hesitated. Every second felt like an hour, but something in Marin's calm certainty made Brooks pause, his hand hovering in the air, as if physically holding back the entire team. Marin lowered herself onto her knees, several feet away from the stretcher, far enough that Titan would not see her as an immediate threat, close enough that he could hear her clearly. She did not reach out. She did not speak commands. She simply looked at him, meeting his wild, frightened eyes with a steadiness that seemed to defy the chaos around her. Titan's growl faltered for just a moment, uncertain, confused by the stillness of this new person who was not rushing at him, not shouting, not trying to grab him. Marin began to hum. It was soft, barely audible over the beeping monitors and hushed voices, a simple, old melody that seemed to belong to another time entirely. The tune was gentle, rocking, the kind of sound a mother might use to soothe a crying infant in the middle of the night. The room fell unnervingly quiet. Even Brooks, standing with his hand still raised, seemed to forget himself for a second, watching as the young nurse continued her soft, wordless song. Titan's ears twitched. His growl faded into something quieter, a low whine instead of a threat. His body, which had been rigid with tension, seemed to loosen just slightly, though his eyes remained locked on Marin, wary and searching. "That's it," Marin whispered between notes, her voice barely above the melody itself. "I know you're scared. I know you don't trust any of us. But he needs help, and I promise, I am not here to hurt him." Titan's pause shifted. He did not move away from Ethan, but his stance softened, no longer a wall of teeth and fury, but something closer to a frightened animal, clinging to the only steady thing left in his world. Dr. Brooks exchanged a look with Grace Turner, both of them stunned into silence. Neither had ever seen anything like this. Not in years of trauma work, not in all the chaos that came through those emergency doors. "Keep going," Brooks said quietly, almost to himself. "Whatever you're doing, keep going." Marin nodded, never breaking her gentle rhythm, and slowly, carefully, she rose to her feet, still humming, and took one small step closer to the stretcher. Titan's eyes followed her, but he did not growl. He did not snap. He simply watched, his breathing beginning to slow, his massive frame trembling now not with aggression, but with something that looked almost like exhaustion, like relief. "Good boy," Marin whispered. "Good, brave boy." Behind her, the trauma team began to move again, cautiously, quietly, careful not to break whatever fragile peace had settled over the room. IV lines were checked. Vitals were called out in hushed tones. The countdown that had frozen only moments earlier began ticking forward again. But this time, it was not fighting against a snarling animal. It was working alongside him. Nathan Price, the commanding officer who had escorted the unit back from the mission, stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching in stunned silence. He had seen Titan in the field, had watched him take down threats without hesitation, had seen the bond between the dog and Ethan grow stronger. With every mission they survived together. He had never once seen anyone calm the animal this quickly. "She's not even touching him," Nathan murmured to Henry Dawson beside him. "She doesn't need to," Henry replied, his voice low with something like awe. "Look at him. He's listening." Marin continued to sing, her voice barely rising above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire room with a strange, unexpected calm. She took another step closer, until she was standing directly beside the stretcher, close enough now to reach out and gently rest her hand on Titan's back. He flinched at first, muscles tensing beneath her palm, but he did not pull away. He did not growl. He simply stood there, trembling, allowing this stranger's touch for the first time since the helicopter had landed. "I need vitals," Brooks called out, his voice steadier now, more focused. "Someone get me a line in his left arm. We need to move." The team sprang into action around Marin and Titan, moving with practiced urgency, now that the greatest obstacle standing between them and their patient had finally, impossibly, stood down. Marin kept her hand on Titan's back, her humming never faltering, even as the noise around them picked up again, monitors beeping louder, voices calling out numbers, the rush of feet against tile floors. Through it all, she remained a small island of stillness, a single steady point, in an ocean of urgency. Ethan's eyes fluttered weakly, barely conscious, but for one brief moment, they seemed to focus, finding the shape of his dog standing calmly beside him, instead of fighting the very people trying to save his life. "He's not fighting anymore," Ethan murmured, his voice cracked and barely audible. "Titan, he's not fighting." "He trusts us now," Marin said softly, leaning down just slightly so he could hear her over the chaos. "Just rest. We've got you both." Ethan's eyes closed again, his body finally allowing itself to give in to the exhaustion and pain that had been held at bay by pure adrenaline and fear for his companion's safety. The monitors continued their steady rhythm of beeps, no longer frantic but focused, purposeful. Brooks looked over at Marin, something like disbelief and gratitude mixing in his expression. "How did you know that would work?" Marin shook her head slightly, still humming under her breath, still keeping her hand steady on Titan's trembling back. "I didn't know for certain. I just knew he needed something familiar, something that wasn't shouting or grabbing. Fear doesn't respond to force. Sometimes it only responds to stillness." Grace Turner stepped closer, glancing down at Titan, who now sat quietly beside the stretcher, his golden eyes following every movement of the medical team with careful, watchful attention, but no longer with aggression. "We need to move him into surgery," Brooks said, his tone all business again now that the crisis had passed. "Ellis, can that dog handle being separated for the procedure?" Marin looked down at Titan, who seemed to sense the shift in the conversation, his ears perking slightly, his body tensing once more. "I don't think separating them completely is going to work," Marin said carefully. "Not yet. Not after everything he's just been through." Nathan Price stepped forward from the doorway, his voice steady with the authority of someone used to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Is there any way to keep the dog close during surgery?" even from a distance. Brooks hesitated, glancing at the surgical suite doors down the hallway, weighing protocol against the reality standing in front of him. We can set him up in the observation room, glass wall. He'll be able to see the operating room, but he won't be able to interfere. Marin nodded slowly, still keeping her hand pressed gently against Titan's back, feeling the tension beginning to build in his muscles again as the moment of separation approached. "I'll stay with him," she said. "Someone needs to keep him calm while Ethan is in surgery. I don't think he'll settle for anyone else right now." Brooks studied her for a long moment, weighing the unconventional request against the very real possibility that without her, the entire situation could unravel again. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. Turner, get Ellis reassigned to the observation room. Keep that dog calm, keep him quiet, and for the love of everything, do not let him get loose." As the stretcher began to move, wheeled swiftly toward the surgical suite, Titan's body went rigid again, his eyes locking onto Ethan's fading form with a desperation that cut through every ounce of calm Marin had managed to build. "Easy," she whispered, moving alongside him now, her hand still resting on his back as they walked together down the hallway, following the stretcher at a careful distance. I know it's hard, but we're going to stay right here, and we're going to watch over him together." Titan's whine grew louder, more insistent, but he did not lunge, did not pull away from her side. Instead, he pressed closer to her, as if some instinct told him that this stranger, with her quiet voice and steady hands, was now the only thing standing between him and losing everything. The doors to the surgical suite swung shut ahead of them, and Marin guided Titan toward the small observation room just beside it, her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit, fully aware that the true test of everything she had just accomplished was only beginning. Behind the glass, the surgical team began to prepare, their movements swift and practiced, while somewhere deep beneath the layers of exhaustion and fear, Ethan Cole held on to the last thread of consciousness, trusting, for the first time in hours, that both he and his closest companion might actually make it through the night. The observation room was small, barely large enough for a bench, a rolling chair, and the wide glass window that looked directly into the operating theater. Marin guided Titan to the corner farthest from the door, away from the hallway traffic, and sat down on the cold floor beside him, rather than take the chair. She wanted to be at his level, close enough that he could feel her presence without needing to look up for it. Through the glass, the surgical team moved with quiet precision. Dr. Brooks stood at the center, flanked by an anesthesiologist named Olivia Grant and 2 surgical nurses, their hands steady, despite the tension radiating from every corner of the room. Ethan lay motionless on the table now, machines monitoring every breath, every heartbeat, every fragile sign of life. Titan pressed his nose against the glass, a soft whine escaping him as he watched his handler disappear beneath layers of surgical drapes and equipment. Marin placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremble beneath his fur. "He's still here," she said quietly. "You can see him. That's more than most people get." Henry Dawson appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still in his flight suit, dark circles forming under his eyes from exhaustion. He hesitated before stepping inside, glancing at Titan with cautious respect, before settling onto the bench across from Marin. "You did something back there that none of us could," he said. "We tried everything. Commands, food. Even his old handler tried to reach him over video call from the base. Nothing worked." "He wasn't refusing to listen," Marin said, keeping her voice low, rhythmic, almost like she was still humming even when she spoke plain words. "He was terrified. Commands don't mean anything to a mind that's convinced everyone around it is a threat. He needed something that felt safe, not something that felt like an order." Henry nodded slowly, watching Titan's ears flick toward every sound beyond the glass. They've been together for 4 years, 3 deployments. Titan pulled him out of a collapsed building once, dug through rubble with his own paws until his nails were bleeding, just to reach him. And a year ago, during an ambush in a narrow valley, Titan took a hit meant for Ethan, nearly died. Ethan carried him 3 miles to the extraction point himself, refusing to let anyone else touch him. Marin looked down at Titan, understanding settling over her like a weight. This was not simple loyalty. This was survival built on shared hardship. two beings who had learned that the only safety in a dangerous world came from each other. "What happened out there today?" she asked. "The mission." Henry's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to be somewhere else entirely, back in the dust and chaos of wherever they had come from. Routine patrol turned into an ambush. Explosive device, followed by gunfire from higher ground. Ethan took shrapnel to his side and leg. Titan tried to drag him to cover, refused to leave him even when the team tried to move them both. By the time the medevac arrived, Ethan had lost a lot of blood, and Titan hadn't left his side for even a second, not even when the rest of the unit needed to secure the area. Through the glass, Dr. Brooks called out something to his team, his voice sharp with focus. Titan's ears shot up immediately, his body tensing, a low growl building in his throat as he watched the sudden flurry of movement around the operating table. "Easy," Marin said quickly, shifting closer, resting both hands now on either side of his neck, feeling his pulse racing beneath her fingers. "They're helping him. That's what all that movement means. They're helping." She began to hum again, softer this time, barely more than a breath of sound, but it seemed to reach through Titan's rising panic just enough to keep him from lunging at the glass. His growl faded slowly into a low, anxious whine, his eyes never leaving the scene beyond the window. "They're clamping a bleeder," Henry murmured, watching closely, his own experience with battlefield injuries giving him just enough understanding to interpret the controlled chaos on the other side of the glass. "That's a good sign, actually. Means they found the problem." Minutes passed like hours. Marin kept her hand steady on Titan's back, her humming rising and falling depending on the tension in the room beyond the glass, a strange kind of duet between the medical team's urgent work and her own quiet effort to hold the fragile piece together. Nathan Price entered eventually, his commanding presence filling the small room even as he took a seat near the door, careful not to crowd the space Titan seemed to need. He watched the surgery for a long moment before speaking. "I've known Cole for 6 years," he said finally. "Watched him go through 2 handlers before Titan. Neither partnership worked the way this one did. There's something between them that goes beyond training. I've seen dogs protect their handlers before. I've never seen one refuse an entire hospital staff to do it. Some bonds aren't built through training," Marin said softly. "They're built through fear and pain and choosing to stay anyway, over and over, until staying becomes the only thing that makes sense." Nathan studied her for a moment. Something like curiosity flickered across his face. "You sound like you understand that better than most nurses would." Marin's hand paused briefly on Titan's back, before continuing its slow, steady motion. "I grew up around dogs that had been through difficult situations. My mother ran a shelter for animals that nobody else wanted. I learned early that fear doesn't listen to logic. It only listens to patience." Through the glass, an alarm suddenly blared, sharp and piercing, cutting through the quiet tension of the observation room like a blade. Titan's entire body went rigid, a sharp bark tearing from his throat as he lunged toward the glass, front paws slamming against the window with enough force to make the frame rattle. "Ethan!" Henry shouted, jumping to his feet, watching in horror as the surgical team suddenly surged into motion, voices rising, machines flashing warnings across their screens. "His heart rate is dropping," Olivia Grant's voice carried faintly through the glass, muffled but unmistakable in its urgency, blood pressure crashing. Marin's own heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay grounded, wrapping both arms around Titan now, holding him back from the glass with every bit of strength she had. He fought against her grip, desperate to reach the man he had spent years protecting, his bark turning into something closer to a howl of pure anguish. "No, no, stay with me," Marin said, her voice trembling now despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Titan, look at me. Look at me, please." But Titan's focus remained locked on the scene beyond the glass, where Dr. Brooks was calling out orders in rapid succession, where nurses moved with frantic precision, where the machine monitoring Ethan's heart displayed a rhythm that looked nothing like it should. "Medication now," Brooks barked. "Compressions." Henry stood frozen at the glass, his hands pressed flat against it, watching as the surgical team began chest compressions on the man he had flown across dangerous terrain to save. Nathan's face had gone pale, his usual composure cracking under the weight of watching one of his best operators fight for his life on an operating table. Maren held Titan tighter, her own voice breaking as she tried to keep humming despite the fear tightening around her throat. The melody faltered, replaced for a moment by something closer to a desperate whisper. "Stay with him," she said, not entirely sure anymore whether she was speaking to Titan or simply hoping out loud. "Please, just stay." The seconds stretched unbearably long. Titan's whines turned into low, broken sounds unlike anything Maren had heard from him before, a grief that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than simple fear. She could feel his heartbeat racing beneath her hands, matching the frantic rhythm of alarms still blaring on the other side of the glass. Then, gradually, the monitor's erratic pattern began to steady. The alarm's pitch softened. Dr. Brooks stepped back slightly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, though his focus remained locked on his patient. "We've got a rhythm," Olivia Grant announced, relief evident even through the muffled glass. "Pressure's coming back up." Henry exhaled sharply, pressing his forehead against the cool glass for a moment, his relief so profound it looked almost like pain. Nathan closed his eyes briefly, murmuring something under his breath that might have simply been Ethan's name. Titan's body slowly began to relax within Maren's grip, though his eyes remained fixed on the operating table, watching every movement with an intensity that seemed to demand proof, undeniable proof, that his handler was truly still there. "He's back," Maren whispered, her own voice shaking now with the release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Ethan's back, Titan. He's still fighting." She resumed her humming, softer now, gentler, a lullaby of relief rather than desperation, and slowly, Titan's breathing began to even out, his massive frame sinking down against her side, as if the fight had drained every ounce of strength from him. Nathan turned away from the glass finally, running a hand over his face. "I've led men into difficult situations most people can't imagine," he said quietly. "I've never felt as helpless as I did just now, watching through glass, unable to do a single thing to help." "None of us could do anything," Henry said, his voice still rough with emotion, "except wait and hope and trust the people whose job it is to fight for him now." Maren looked down at Titan, who had gone quiet now, his eyes half closed, exhaustion finally beginning to overtake the alertness that had kept him watchful and desperate for so many hours. She continued stroking his fur gently, her humming barely audible now, more for her own comfort than his. "We should let him rest," she said softly. "He's been fighting just as hard as anyone in that room, maybe harder." Henry nodded, glancing toward the operating theater where the team had resumed their careful, focused work. The crisis apparently passed for now, though the tension in the air remained thick and unresolved. "How much longer do you think this will take?" Nathan asked, settling back into his seat near the door, his eyes never quite leaving the window. "Surgeries like this can take hours," Maren said, "especially after complications like we just saw. All we can do now is stay close, and keep him calm, and trust the people doing everything they can on the other side of that glass." The room fell into a heavy, watchful silence after that, broken only by the occasional murmur from the surgical team beyond the window, the steady beeping of monitors slowly returning to a rhythm that no longer threatened to stop entirely. Titan remained curled against Maren's side, his breathing slow and even now, though his ears twitched at every small sound, every shift in the room beyond the glass, refusing even in exhaustion to fully let his guard down. Maren glanced at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by with slow, heavy patience, aware that whatever happened next would determine not just whether Ethan Cole survived the night, but whether the fragile trust she had built with the animal curled against her would hold through whatever trials still lay ahead. Outside the small observation room, the hospital continued its endless rhythm of movement and urgency, unaware that within these walls, a story far larger than any single patient was quietly unfolding, one breath, one heartbeat, one soft note of song at a time. An hour passed before Dr. Brooks stepped back from the table again, this time pulling down his mask just enough to speak to Olivia Grant in low, clipped tones that Maren could not quite make out through the glass. Whatever he said made the anesthesiologist's brow furrow, her eyes flicking briefly toward a nearby monitor before she nodded and reached for something on the instrument tray. Titan's ears rose again, alert to the shift in tone, even though he could not understand the words. Marin felt the tension return to his body beneath her palm, and she resumed her low humming immediately, not waiting for him to spiral into panic this time. "What's happening now?" she asked Henry quietly, keeping her eyes on Titan even as she spoke. Henry leaned forward, squinting through the glass. "Looks like they found more damage than they expected. Shrapnel doesn't always sit where the scans show it. Sometimes it travels, nicks something on the way that wasn't obvious at first." Nathan straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening. "How bad?" "Hard to say from here," Henry admitted. "But Brooks looks like a man who just found a problem he wasn't prepared for." Inside the operating room, Dr. Brooks called for additional blood units, his voice carrying the particular urgency of someone racing against a clock only he could fully see. Nurses moved swiftly, one disappearing through a side door, while another adjusted the flow of fluids running into Ethan's arm. "He's lost more blood than the scans suggested," Brooks said, loud enough now that his voice carried faintly through the glass. "We need to move faster." Titan whined, low and constant, his eyes never leaving the table where his handler lay, unmoving except for the artificial rhythm of the ventilator. Marin pressed her forehead briefly against the top of his head, breathing slowly, trying to steady herself as much as him. "You want to know something strange?" she said softly, more to fill the tense silence than anything else, though she found herself speaking as much for her own comfort now. "The first dog I ever helped calm down like this wasn't nearly as big as you. She was a small mixed breed, found tied up outside a shelter in the middle of winter, so frightened of people that she would not let anyone within 10 feet of her cage." Henry glanced over, listening despite the tension in the room, perhaps grateful for anything that offered a moment's distraction from the scene beyond the glass. "My mother spent 3 weeks trying every technique she knew," Marin continued, her voice falling into the same gentle rhythm she used when humming. "Nothing worked. The dog would flatten herself against the back wall of her enclosure and shake any time someone approached. One evening I was sitting nearby, exhausted, humming without even realizing I was doing it, some old tune my grandmother used to sing. I noticed the dog had crept closer to the front of her cage, ears up, watching me." "What happened?" Nathan asked, his attention fully on her now, despite the surgery unfolding just beyond the glass. "I kept humming every evening after that. Never approached her directly, never reached for her, just sat close enough for her to hear, and let her decide when she was ready to come closer. It took another 2 weeks before she finally let me touch her. But once she did, she never went back to being that frightened animal in the corner again." Titan's whine softened slightly as Marin's voice settled into its familiar rhythm, though his eyes remained locked on the operating table, watching every subtle shift in the medical team's movements. "Fear needs proof," Marin continued. "Not promises, not commands. Proof, given slowly, over and over, until the mind finally accepts that safety is real." Through the glass, the surgical team's movements began to shift again, the frantic energy of moments earlier giving way to something more focused, more controlled. Dr. Brooks straightened slightly, his shoulders no longer hunched with the particular tension of a surgeon fighting to stay ahead of a worsening situation. "I think they found it," Henry said, watching closely. "Whatever was bleeding. Looks like they've got it under control." Olivia Grant's voice carried through the glass again, steadier now. "Pressure's stabilizing. We're not losing him." Titan's ears perked at the shift in tone among the humans in the observation room, sensing perhaps that the crisis had passed, even if he could not understand the words themselves. His whine faded into something closer to a low, exhausted breath, his body sagging further against Marin's side. "See?" Marin whispered to him, resting her cheek briefly against his head. "They're winning. He's still fighting, and they're still helping him fight." Nathan let out a long breath, some of the color returning to his face, as he watched the team's movements settle into a calmer, more methodical pace. "I don't think I've prayed that hard since my first deployment." "You get used to that feeling," Henry said quietly, "but you never stop hating it." The next hour passed more steadily, the surgical team working with focused determination rather than the desperate urgency that had gripped the room during the crisis. Marin kept her hand on Titan's back throughout, her humming rising and falling gently with the rhythm of the room, though she no longer felt the need to hold him back from the glass. He seemed content now to simply watch, his body finally settling into something resembling calm. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the small room. "Of course," Marin replied. "Why did you step forward earlier?" Most people in that room were terrified of him. Dr. Brooks nearly had that tech shoot him full of sedative. "What made you think you could do something different?" Marin considered the question for a moment, watching Titan's chest rise and fall in slow, even breaths. "I saw a dog trying to protect the only thing he had left in a world that suddenly felt very unsafe. I didn't see a threat. I saw fear wearing the shape of aggression. Those are two very different things, even if they look the same on the outside." "Not everyone can tell the difference," Nathan observed. "No," Marin agreed. "But once you've spent enough time around fear, you learn to recognize it, no matter what form it takes." Through the glass, Dr. Brooks straightened fully now, stepping back from the table as two nurses began the careful process of closing the surgical site. His shoulders, which had carried the weight of the entire operation for hours, finally began to relax. "We're closing," Brooks announced, his voice carrying clearly now, no longer strained with urgency. "Vitals are stable." He made it through. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their full meaning registered. Henry closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for most of the night. Nathan's shoulders sagged with visible relief, and even his usual composed expression cracked into something closer to raw emotion. Titan's head lifted sharply, his eyes locking onto the movement beyond the glass with renewed focus, sensing perhaps that something significant had just shifted in the room. "He made it," Marin whispered, her own voice thick with emotion she hadn't realized she'd been suppressing. "Titan, he made it through." The dog's ears rose fully now, his body straightening beside her, no longer slumped with exhaustion, but alert with something that looked remarkably like hope. He pressed his nose against the glass again, this time gently, without the desperate urgency of before, simply watching as the surgical team began the careful process of finishing their work. "What happens now?" Nathan asked, looking toward Marin for guidance now as much as toward the medical staff. "They'll move him to intensive care," Marin said. "He'll need close monitoring for the next several days. The next 48 hours are usually the most critical after an operation like this." "And Titan?" Henry asked, glancing down at the dog who had not moved from Marin's side in hours. Marin looked down at Titan, considering the question carefully. "I don't think he's going to accept being separated from him now. Not after everything they've both been through tonight. We'll need to figure out how to keep them close, at least until Ethan is stable enough for Titan to trust that he's not in danger anymore." Dr. Brooks emerged from the operating room a short while later, pulling off his surgical cap, exhaustion evident in every line of his face despite the clear relief in his eyes. He stepped into the observation room, glancing first at Titan, who watched him with cautious but no longer hostile attention, before turning to Marin. "That was some of the closest work I've done in years," he admitted. "We lost him for almost 30 seconds in there. Managed to bring him back, found the second bleed just in time. Another few minutes, and we might not have. But he's stable now," Marin said, needing to hear the confirmation despite already knowing the answer from his tone. "Stable, but critical," Brooks clarified. "The next 2 days will tell us a lot. His body's been through significant trauma, and recovery from something like this isn't guaranteed just because he survived the surgery itself." Titan's ears flattened slightly at the shift in Brooks's tone, sensing perhaps that the danger, while lessened, had not entirely passed. Marin rested a hand on his back again, offering what reassurance she could, even as her own heart tightened with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Can he be moved somewhere that Titan can stay close?" Marin asked. "I don't think forcing separation right now is going to help either of them." Brooks considered the request for a long moment, weighing hospital protocol against the very real evidence he had witnessed firsthand, of just how much this particular animal's presence seemed to matter. Finally, he nodded. "There's a private recovery suite on the 3rd floor, usually reserved for high-profile patients who need extra security. It's large enough to accommodate a crate, maybe even more than that, given the circumstances. I'll clear it with administration." "Thank you," Marin said, relief washing through her at the small victory. "Don't thank me yet," Brooks said, though his tone had softened considerably from the sharp urgency of earlier. "The real fight is just getting started. Surviving surgery is one thing. Surviving recovery is another. As the surgical team began preparing to transfer Ethan to intensive care, Marin guided Titan toward the door, keeping him close, keeping her voice low and steady, aware that whatever peace they had found tonight remained fragile, built on hours of careful, patient work that could unravel just as quickly if the days ahead brought further complications. Behind them, the operating room lights dimmed as the exhausted surgical team began cleaning up, their work for the night finally complete, even as the true uncertainty of Ethan Cole's recovery still lay entirely ahead. The private recovery suite on the third floor was quieter than the rest of the hospital, tucked away from the main corridors, with thick walls that muted the constant hum of activity elsewhere in the building. A hospital bed stood at its center, surrounded by monitoring equipment, while a wide, padded crate had been set up nearby, though Titan showed no interest in using it, choosing instead to lie directly beside the bed, close enough to rest his head against the edge of the mattress. Marin had been given a temporary reassignment to monitor the unusual arrangement, her supervisor recognizing quickly that whatever bond she had formed with the animal was proving more valuable than any conventional protocol. She sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, watching the steady rise and fall of Ethan's chest, watching Titan's eyes track every movement of the machines around them. Grace Turner checked vitals every hour through the night, moving carefully around Titan's presence, having learned quickly that sudden movements near the bed triggered a low, warning growl, though nothing more aggressive than that now. The dog seemed to have accepted a fragile truce, allowing medical staff to work as long as Marin remained close, and the movements stayed calm. By morning, Ethan's condition remained stable, though he had not yet woken from the anesthesia and pain medication keeping him deeply unconscious. Dr. Brooks visited twice, checking the surgical site, adjusting medication levels, his expression cautiously optimistic each time. "His numbers look good," Brooks said during his second visit, glancing at the monitor readouts with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years learning to read the subtle language of vital signs. "Better than I expected, given how close we came last night." "When do you think he'll wake up?" Marin asked, glancing at Titan, who had not moved from his position beside the bed, except to occasionally shift his weight, never taking his eyes off Ethan's face for more than a few seconds at a time. "Could be later today, could be tomorrow," Brooks said. "The body decides these things on its own timeline. All we can do is keep watching, keep supporting him, and wait." Henry Dawson stopped by later that afternoon, still in civilian clothes now instead of his flight uniform, looking rested for the first time since the mission had ended. He brought a small bag of dog food and a worn blanket that smelled faintly of diesel fuel and dust, items retrieved from the unit's supply that Titan had apparently grown accustomed to over years of deployments. "Thought he might want something familiar," Henry explained, setting the blanket down near the crate. Titan's ears perked at the scent, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he rose from his spot beside the bed and moved toward the blanket, sniffing it carefully before settling down on top of it, though he positioned himself so he could still see Ethan clearly. "That's the first time he's moved more than a few inches since surgery," Marin observed, watching with quiet relief. "He trusts you," Henry said, settling into the chair across from her. "More than I've ever seen him trust anyone outside his unit. I think he's just exhausted enough now to let his guard down a little," Marin said. "Trust takes longer to build than one night, even under circumstances like these." Nathan Price arrived shortly after, carrying a tablet displaying updates from the rest of the unit, most of whom had returned safely from the mission with only minor injuries. He shared brief updates with Henry, in low tones, before turning his attention to Ethan's still form on the bed. "The team wants to know if they can visit," Nathan said. "A few of them served alongside him for years. They're worried. Once he's more stable, absolutely," Marin said. "Right now, I think keeping the room calm is the most important thing we can do for both of them." As evening approached, Marin noticed a subtle change in Ethan's breathing pattern, faster than it had been throughout the day, accompanied by a faint sheen of sweat forming across his forehead, despite the room's carefully controlled temperature. She called for Grace Turner immediately, her instincts sharpening with the kind of alertness that came from years of trauma nursing. Grace checked his temperature quickly, her expression shifting to concern as she read the display. 102.4. That's a significant jump from this morning. Titan's head lifted sharply from the blanket, his nose twitching as he seemed to sense the change in the room's atmosphere before either nurse had finished speaking. A low whine escaped him, and he rose to his feet, moving closer to the bed again, pressing his nose gently against Ethan's hand. "Could be a post-surgical infection," Grace said, already reaching for the call button to summon Dr. Brooks. "We need to get blood work done immediately." Marin felt her stomach tighten with a fear she hadn't expected to feel again so soon, watching as the peaceful stability of the day suddenly threatened to unravel. Titan's whine grew more insistent, and she moved quickly to his side, placing a steadying hand on his back, even as her mind raced through the implications of a possible infection so soon after major surgery. "It's okay," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than it had the night before. "The doctors are going to check him now. We just need to stay calm and let them work." Dr. Brooks arrived within minutes, his exhausted expression sharpening into focused concern as he examined the readings and ordered immediate blood work. Titan watched every movement carefully, his body tense but no longer aggressive, seeming to have internalized somehow that this particular kind of urgency, while frightening, was not the same threat he had fought against the night before. "We'll know more once the labs come back," Brooks said, drawing a blood sample himself with quick, practiced efficiency. "Could be a simple post-operative fever, common enough after surgery this extensive. Could be something more serious. I don't want to speculate until we have data." The next several hours passed in tense uncertainty, Marin maintaining her position beside the bed, occasionally humming softly to keep Titan calm, as unfamiliar hospital staff moved in and out of the room, drawing additional samples, adjusting medication, monitoring Ethan's rising fever with careful attention. By midnight, the lab results returned, and Dr. Brooks reviewed them with visible relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. Elevated white blood cell count, consistent with the body's normal response to significant trauma and surgery. No signs of a localized infection at the surgical site. "This looks like a standard post-operative fever, not an infection requiring additional intervention." "So he'll be okay?" Marin asked, needing the direct confirmation despite the encouraging tone of the report. "His body's fighting to heal itself," Brooks said. "The fever should break within the next day or so as his immune system settles. We'll continue monitoring closely, but this isn't the setback I was worried it might be." Relief washed through the room, palpable enough that even Titan seemed to sense the shift, his tense posture finally beginning to relax again as the immediate crisis passed. He returned to his blanket beside the bed, though he kept his eyes open longer than before, watching Ethan's face for any further signs of distress. Grace administered fever-reducing medication through Ethan's IV line, and gradually, over the following hours, his temperature began to decrease, the sheen of sweat on his forehead fading as his body settled into a calmer rhythm. Marin remained at her post throughout the night, exhaustion pulling at her own body after nearly 36 hours without proper rest, but she refused to leave, aware that her presence remained a critical part of keeping the fragile peace between Titan and the rest of the medical staff intact. Around 3 in the morning, as the hospital settled into its quietest hours, Marin noticed Ethan's fingers twitch slightly against the blanket covering him. She leaned forward immediately, watching closely, her heart quickening with cautious hope. Titan noticed the movement as well, lifting his head sharply, a soft whine escaping him as he pressed closer to the bed, watching Ethan's face with an intensity that seemed to demand consciousness through sheer force of will. "Ethan?" Marin said softly, reaching for the call button to alert the medical team while keeping her attention fixed on the man before her. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, though they did not fully open, his breathing shifting into something slightly more alert than the deep, medicated unconsciousness that had held him for the past day and a half. A faint sound escaped his lips, barely more than a breath, but enough to make Titan's tail thump softly against the floor for the first time since the ordeal had begun. Grace arrived quickly, checking his vitals with careful attention. "He's coming out of the sedation. This is a good sign, though it might take a while before he's fully conscious and coherent." Marin watched as Ethan's fingers curled slightly, as if searching for something familiar, even in his semi-conscious state. Without hesitation, she guided Titan's head gently toward his hand, allowing the dog's fur to brush against his fingertips. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Ethan's fingers tightened weakly around a handful of Titan's fur, and though his eyes remained closed, a faint, exhausted smile touched the corner of his mouth. "He knows you're here," Marin whispered to Titan, her own eyes stinging with emotion she hadn't expected to feel this strongly. "He's always known you're here." Titan's tail continued its soft, steady thump against the floor, his earlier tension finally giving way to something that looked remarkably like peace, as if some deep, instinctive part of him finally believed that the fight, at least for now, had truly been won. Dr. Brooks arrived shortly after, reviewing the updated readings with quiet satisfaction. "This is exactly the progress we hoped for. Give it another day, and I think we'll see him fully awake and responsive." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the hospital windows, Marin remained beside the bed, one hand resting on Titan's back, the other close enough to Ethan's that she could feel the faint warmth of his skin, watching over both of them as the long, uncertain night finally gave way to something that felt, for the first time in over a day, genuinely hopeful. Ethan Cole fully opened his eyes just after noon the following day, blinking slowly against the bright light filtering through the window blinds, his mind struggling to piece together fragmented memories of dust, gunfire, and pain that seemed to blur together into a single overwhelming impression of chaos. The first clear thing he registered was warmth pressed against his hand, and the second was a pair of familiar amber eyes watching him, with an intensity that cut through the fog of medication still clouding his thoughts. "Titan," he rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse, barely more than a whisper. Titan's response was immediate, a low, joyful whine escaping him as he pressed his head firmly against Ethan's palm, his tail thumping steadily against the floor, in a rhythm that seemed to carry days of pent-up relief. Marin rose from her chair, moving carefully to avoid startling either of them, though Titan barely acknowledged her presence now beyond a brief glance, his full attention consumed by the man finally awake before him. "Welcome back," Marin said softly, offering a small cup of water with a straw, helping Ethan take slow, careful sips. "You gave us quite a scare." Ethan's eyes shifted toward her, confusion evident despite his exhaustion. Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," Marin explained gently. "You were brought in after your unit was ambushed. You've been through surgery, and you're recovering now. I'm Marin, one of the nurses who's been looking after you." Memory seemed to slowly return to him in fragments, his brow furrowing as pieces began falling into place. The valley, the explosion. I remember Titan pulling at my vest, trying to get me to cover. "He never left your side," Marin confirmed. "Not during the flight here, not during surgery. The whole hospital learned very quickly just how devoted he is to you." A faint, exhausted smile touched Ethan's lips as he shifted his hand slightly to stroke Titan's fur, the dog leaning into the touch with visible contentment. "He's always been like this, ever since we were paired together. Some handlers say their dogs work for them. Titan's never worked for me. He's fought alongside me, every single time." "I believe it," Marin said. "He wouldn't let anyone near you when you first arrived. Not doctors, not nurses, not even his own handling unit. It took quite a bit of convincing to get him to allow the medical team to help you." Ethan's expression shifted, something like gratitude and curiosity mixing together as he studied her more closely. "How did you manage that?" "From what I remember hearing about him with strangers, that shouldn't have been possible." Marin hesitated, glancing down at Titan before answering. "I sang to him. An old lullaby. Nothing special, really. Sometimes fear needs something familiar to hold on to. Something that isn't shouting orders or trying to force control. He just needed to know he wasn't alone in trying to protect you." Ethan's gaze softened further, understanding passing between them in a way that required no further explanation. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond simple politeness. "For both of us." Dr. Brooks entered a short while later, reviewing Ethan's vitals with clear satisfaction. "Good to see you awake, Master Chief. Your recovery has been remarkable, all things considered. We'll need to monitor you for a few more days, but I'm confident you're on the road to a full recovery." "Thank you, Doctor," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger already, though exhaustion still lingered heavily beneath the surface. "I understand I owe quite a bit to your team, and to this remarkable nurse who managed to calm my partner down." Brooks glanced toward Marin, a rare smile touching his usually stern expression. "She did something none of us thought was possible. I've been practicing trauma medicine for over 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened in that emergency bay. Over the following days, Ethan's recovery progressed steadily, his strength slowly returning as he began sitting up, then eventually standing with careful assistance, Titan never straying more than a few feet from his side throughout every small milestone. The hospital staff grew accustomed to the unusual pair, many stopping by simply to witness the now famous bond between the wounded SEAL and his devoted combat partner. Henry Dawson and Nathan Price visited regularly, along with several other members of Ethan's unit, once they learned he was awake and improving. The stories they shared painted a fuller picture for Marin of the man she had been caring for, a soldier known throughout his unit not just for his skill, but for a quiet, steady leadership that inspired deep loyalty among everyone who served alongside him. "You should have seen him during our second deployment," one of the visiting team members recalled during an afternoon visit. A broad-shouldered man named Owen Whitfield, who had served alongside Ethan for years, carried 2 wounded men to safety himself when their transport got hit, refused to leave until everyone else was clear first. Ethan waved off the praise with characteristic modesty, though Titan's tail thumped proudly against the floor, as if he understood every word being said about his partner. As the days passed, Marin found herself spending increasing amounts of time in the recovery suite, officially still assigned to monitor the unusual patient arrangement, though the visits soon began to feel like something more than simple professional duty. She and Ethan talked for hours during the quiet afternoons, sharing stories about their vastly different lives, hers built around hospital corridors and the quiet, patient work of healing, his shaped by years of intense training, and the brotherhood forged through shared danger. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said one afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into his recovery, strength having returned enough now that he could sit comfortably in a chair near the window, Titan resting contentedly at his feet. "Of course," Marin replied, settling into the chair across from him. "Why nursing, especially trauma care? It's not exactly the gentlest specialty to choose." Marin considered the question thoughtfully, watching sunlight filter through the window and catch in Titan's fur. "I think I've always been drawn to moments where fear and healing meet. Growing up around my mother's shelter, I saw how much patience it took to bring an animal back from the edge of complete panic. Nursing felt like a natural extension of that. People in crisis need the same thing frightened animals do: steadiness, patience, proof that they're not facing the worst moment of their life entirely alone." Ethan studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine passing across his features. "You gave both of us that, more than you probably realize." "You gave yourselves that," Marin corrected gently. "I just helped create space for the trust that was already there to come through." As Ethan's discharge date approached, hospital staff began preparing him for the transition home, along with a rehabilitation plan that would keep him under observation for several more weeks, even after leaving the intensive recovery suite. Titan, now fully accustomed to hospital routines, had become something of an unofficial mascot throughout the ward, staff members regularly stopping to offer gentle scratches behind his ears whenever he accompanied Ethan on his slow, careful walks through the corridors during physical therapy sessions. On the morning of his discharge, Ethan stood by the window of his room, dressed in civilian clothes for the first time since the ambush, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. Titan sat beside him, alert and healthy, showing no lingering signs of the trauma that had gripped him so completely just weeks before. Marin arrived to complete the final discharge paperwork, finding the pair already prepared for departure, a small bag packed with the few belongings Ethan had accumulated during his stay. "Ready to go home?" she asked, offering a warm smile despite the small pang of something bittersweet settling in her chest at the thought of their daily visits coming to an end. "More than ready," Ethan admitted. "Though I'll admit, I've grown rather fond of this particular hospital." "The staff will miss having you both around," Marin said. "You've become something of a legend already. I don't think anyone will forget what happened in that emergency bay anytime soon." Ethan hesitated for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression before he spoke again. "I was hoping, actually, that this wouldn't have to be goodbye entirely. Titan's taken quite a liking to you, and honestly, so have I. Would you consider joining us for dinner sometime, once I'm settled back home? Nothing formal, just a chance to properly thank you outside these hospital walls." Marin felt warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected invitation, glancing down at Titan, who watched her with the same steady, trusting eyes that had first calmed weeks earlier beneath her gentle humming. "I would like that very much." Titan, as if understanding the significance of the moment, rose and pressed himself gently against Marin's leg, a soft, contented sound rumbling in his chest, the same protective instinct that had once refused to let anyone near his handler now extending, quietly and completely, to include her as well. Weeks turned into months, and the friendship that had begun in the chaos of an emergency room slowly blossomed into something deeper, built on quiet dinners, long walks with Titan through the local park, and the shared understanding of two people who had each, in their own way, learned that true strength often looked like patience rather than force. The story of the combat dog who refused to let anyone touch his wounded handler, calmed only by a gentle song from a stranger, spread throughout military circles and hospital staff alike, becoming something of a quiet legend among those who valued the profound, unshakable bonds formed between soldiers and the loyal animals who fought alongside them. Ethan returned to limited duty months later, his recovery complete, his bond with Titan stronger than ever, forged through an ordeal that had tested every limit of trust and endurance. And in the evenings, when the demands of the day finally settled into quiet, Marin often found herself humming that same old lullaby, no longer out of necessity, but simply out of habit, a small reminder of the night when a soft song had managed to calm the fiercest heart in the room, and in doing so, had changed the course of 3 lives forever.